So welcome everybody, welcome back to our election chats. Today we have the pleasure to have with us two guests, two friends, two professors of American history and American culture. The first one is Dr. Mathilde Roza, who teaches American literature at Radboud University. Mathilde is my colleague at the moment at Radboud. She also teaches the BA and MA in American Studies there, correct me if I'm wrong, and she's an expert on North American Indigenous Studies. The other guest we have is Dr. Eduard van der Bilt, who teaches American history, politics and government both at Leiden University and at the University of Amsterdam. Both of them are part of the big and ever-growing American Studies family in the Netherlands, so it's really a pleasure also on behalf of NASA to have you here. And this time I want to start our conversation, breaking the rules and the tradition, which is always good. And I wanted to start with Mathilde, asking her what does she think about the impact. You know, we've been analyzing and assessing throughout these chats how apparently insane, unpredictable has become the American political landscape in many ways, and also how polarized this political environment is been. Now, in an era in which we thought it was dominated by post-ism, like post-modernity, post-racial country, etc., apparently ideologies, and also very polarizing ideologies, are coming back and are claiming their spaces. So, in some, do you think that identity politics and a strong cultural identification is still the major game changer, the major factor that is characterizing these elections, or it's just something like parenthetical, that once we will have not Trump anymore in the picture, it will be solved and America will be back on track on its post era?
Right. Yes, the issue of identity politics does, of course, dominate the picture that we get, and the polarized landscape is a source of extreme worry and concern. But on the other hand, within that polarization, you see that one group is diversifying in terms of their identity politics and finding each other in that one pole that opposes sort of the more monocultured conservative white pole. And I think that of course, after the election of Obama, there was a lot of talk about post-racial society. But I think that in terms of grassroots mentality among various groups within the United States, there is this desire for groups to come together. And I think that you can see that very well in the Black Lives Matter movement, where, of course, the issue of gender and sexuality and race transcends the agenda of the slogan itself, Black Lives Matter. So I do think that identity politics is going into a direction which is divisive in terms of the two big poles that are opposite each other. But within that one pole, there is a movement of bringing people together from different backgrounds. You have Native people who join the Black Lives Matter movement, just as African Americans joined Idle No More, and the possibilities for solidarity are to me sort of an antidote, or at least seem to provide some more hope than a view of America as simply polarized.
This is very interesting because what you are hinting at is something that I was, for instance, asking in our previous chats also to Mike Schmidli. On the one hand, you have a Republican electoral body or electoral basing that looks like it is very cohesive, very homogeneous. On the other hand, you have a Democratic one that is very varied, multifaceted, which is apparently kept together only by this anti-Trump or anti-populism or anti-nationalistic rhetoric. But what you're saying is that this can really be transformed into electoral cloud, into a positive impulse, a positive stimulus also for the Democratic Party, so not acting as a divisive agent from within.
Yes, I think it's a factor in American society that also deserves attention. In addition to that very sharp polarization that gets a lot of our attention.
Can I add a few remarks too, or respond to your question?
Yes, especially because I saw an interview of yours where you were warning against a possible civil war. So I was very curious about.
In order to draw attention, you have to come up with extreme statements. So I'll pursue that position again today. No, but I mean, two things. I mean, within the Democratic Party itself, of course, there's a debate going on about this very issue. How far should we go in, basing our program on identity politics or on more sober economic issues, right? So even within the Democratic Party, you have a kind of quarrel going on. And then you could also add that, of course, the Republicans will have to engage in identity politics as well. Soon, we hope. The moment you start predicting a dramatic loss for the Republicans this November, they will finally be forced to deal with the issue of identity politics and the white base that is the only base that still supports their politicians and representatives.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem nationwide. It's a problem for the election of the presidency, and it's also a problem for congressional races. But do you think the Republican Party is equipped at the moment to that reckoning?
No, that's of course the basic question. I mean, the great issue or the great problem of American politics these days is, I would say, the Republican Party. Colleagues and other commentators have referred to, of course, the American political system, electoral college, and all these issues, the Senate elections, to indicate what the problems are. I think the main issue is basically the Republican Party. And what we're seeing is a party that no longer has that many ideas. Should we call it brain dead? I'm exaggerating, perhaps, but still, they don't have solutions for all kinds of problems. The party is a disgrace at the moment and can only survive by disenfranchising people. It needs to be redefined. It needs to be abolished the moment it refuses to do so. And the big question is, okay, hopefully they will finally lose in a way that they will be forced to redefine themselves and reorganize, or otherwise the party should simply be abolished, I think, and certain politicians would have to step in and create an alternative. At the moment, of course, the situation looks pretty bleak, given the fact that Trump has taken over the party and no one dares to oppress him or to oppose him.
I can't resist that, or because the assist is really too generous to let it go. But then tell us something about the historical roots of this. When do you think the Republican Party ceased to exist as a fruitful, as an engaging engine of American democracy?
Yeah, we can differ about the chronology, right? I mean, do we want to start with Reagan, or will we embrace a starting point later on? By the time of the Clinton administration, you see the kind of polarized climate that is still creating all of these problems. I think from somewhere in the 1990s onwards, at least, the Republican Party is, going down in terms of its nature, its program, its strategies to win elections.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if Case wants to.
Well, I wonder at how you sort of see this as because you are a historian of I'm addressing this to Eduard. You are a historian of ideas, and of course, once you make a remark about the Republican Party being brain dead, that gets me thinking. Because I do recall, I mean, you don't see it so much nowadays. I think the Trump campaign has effectively sort of given up talking about ideas. But there was an effort, certainly in the beginning of the Trump administration, to sort of shape something like to make it seem as if there was sort of a cohesive ideology around the Trump project, and to connect that both to antecedents in the American past. You think about Trump very prominently handing a portrait of Andrew Jackson in his office, right? He goes to Andrew Jackson's home in Tennessee and sort of reads up these notes that presumably he was given just before the meeting about what a great guy Andrew Jackson was and how he was sort of hounded by the financial elites and the media. And you think about how the Trump project also defines itself internationally, right? It seeks sort of kinship with the Brexit votes, with various kind of right-wing governments in Europe, and tries to kind of define itself as an answer to the challenges and the kind of discontent of globalization. So my question to you was that ever genuine? That sort of the idea around the Trump project, and if so, where is it gone?
Right. Well, the moment you take Trump as your starting point, it was not genuine. At least, Trump is at the heart of the party. Trump is at the heart of American politics. He simply wishes to retain power. In a sense, you could say that all of the rhetoric that was unleashed by many Republican politicians was not genuine. On the other hand, of course, certain projects that were already part of a Republican Party strategy, such as the right-wing populism and the anti-immigration discourse, rhetoric, and policies, were very much part of earlier Republican Party efforts. I mean, they can be traced back to the 1990s, right, when a Republican Party, beginning in California with Governor Wilson, redefined to a certain extent the Republican immigration stance and became vehemently anti-immigration.
And
Trump is in that sense, and in that sense, he's representing major voices within the party. He's following a party line tradition. The fun thing is, though, that as happened at the end of the 19th century, the Republican anti-immigration stance led nowhere. It led to victories of the Democratic Party, right? Because the party could find a new electorate, could find a new base among immigrant laborers in the US. And the fun thing to talk about is that history is repeating itself in that sense, because the Republican Party is going down the same path and it doesn't work. They will have to be open to Latinx people at some point, given demographic developments. They will have to open themselves up to African Americans and to the desires of women.
Which in a sense brings me back to the point that the argument that Mathilde was making in the beginning of this conversation, right? That there is, sometimes identity politics is sort of juxtaposed with the supposedly more objective politics of class, right? There's these real kind of economic issues that we should be focusing on, and we shouldn't be talking about issues of identity. And that, whenever I hear that kind of, it's not always made explicit, but when it is, I always keep thinking, but what, if you are a party of the left, right, someone who represents what passes for the working class in America, what do you think that working class looks like, right? It is overwhelmingly, or at least it is to a very significant degree, composed of women, of people of immigrant backgrounds, of people of Black and who identify as Black or Hispanic. And if you take yourself seriously as politicians of the left, then those are groups whose specific concerns need to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
sorry, Mathilde.
the man that I wanted to talk about, Mark Charles, has very much put this on his particular agenda, and one of the things that he would very much like to organize is to have a national discussion, as he says, on all of these things, on race, on class, on sexism. And he is sort of, I think that is, the very fact that Trump, for instance, has embraced Jackson, bring back, the rhetoric of manifest destiny, and Jackson as the embodiment from the native perspective of policies of Indian removal, which of course were already suggested by Jefferson, but were picked up by Jackson and then implemented in the 1830s. Has triggered an awareness that these issues concerning race, class, and gender are foundational to the United States.
Yeah, perhaps it's good to just briefly introduce this, because you came to us with a proposal that you wanted to talk about a third-party candidate that I suppose many people, his name was new to me, and I suspect he may be new to a lot of our viewers here in the Netherlands. So perhaps you could briefly introduce him and explain perhaps where the interest in this person, Mark Charles, comes from for you.
Yeah, I think that what I thought was very unusual was his pronouncement that there was a lot of inequality and other forms of inequality in the United States, and that this was not despite the Constitution, but because of the Constitution.
So he is, just to back it up slightly, a third-party candidate from a very interesting background who is now running also to be president of the United States.
Yes, but what triggered my interest was him saying this particular thing, and that it was not despite the foundations of the United States of equality and freedom and liberty and pursuit of happiness. That is not despite these things that inequality happens, but exactly because of the way that they have been formulated and written down and have become foundational. So I'd never heard of him either, and I looked him up. He announced his bid to run as a presidential candidate in May 2019, and you may have seen him at the First Nations or Native American Presidential Forum in May 2019. There he spoke, introduced his agenda, and he spoke alongside Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris at that particular moment. He's a Native American activist, a public speaker, a journalist, and an author on Native American issues, and he's also a former pastor of the Christian Indian Center in Denver, Colorado. And I don't know if we'll have an opportunity to also discuss religion, but I think that religion also ties in very interestingly with his candidacy and the ideas that he has. He's of mixed descent. His father is Navajo and his mother is Dutch American. And one of the fun things for us Dutch people is, of course, that whenever he starts speaking and he acknowledges his four clans, the descent of his father and his mother, he says as a Navajo, which I cannot, of course, speak, but he then says something which he himself translates as "I'm from the wooden shoe people." So he's become known as a person who denounces the doctrine of discovery, and that's based on a book that he has written, Unsettling Truths. That book is called, let me look at the subtitle here, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And he's co-written this with a Korean-American scholar who's also a reverend from Chicago, Soong Chan Ra. So that's something that he's become well known for And before that, he had some visibility in the context of the Dakota pipeline protests. Yeah, he's been trying to get ballot access. He only has access in the state of Colorado. He has so-called write-in status in 18 states. So that's something that he has accomplished, that people can actually write his name on the ballot. And he can do that in Alabama, Alaska, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Iowa, Maine, Mississippi, Montana, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, Washington, Washington, D.C., West Virginia, and Wyoming.
Okay.
And when he says that the Constitution created the problems that Americans are facing these days, what exactly does he mean? Does he refer to certain clauses of the Constitution that will explain the current day situation?
Yeah. I think that his argument is that he feels that the white majority has a mythological understanding of American history. Exceptionalism and expansion and discovery and opportunity are sort of the magical, mythical words that are always invoked when American history is discussed. And on the other hand, then you have communities of color, women, who have a totally different history of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, segregation, sexism, exclusion, boarding schools, internment camps. And yeah, there is no common history in that sense, and there's no common memory. And he wants to work towards a nation that does have a common memory, so that we the people truly comes to mean all the people. And that's sort of the motto of his campaign, that we the people should be transformed into something else, namely all the people. And then he points to texts indeed in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. Of course, the Declaration of Independence still has this phrase about the merciless Indian savages. And the preamble to the Constitution also, but he also wants, he wants to suggest that that the Constitution is rewritten to also remove sexist language, so that the he, him, his is replaced by their, and he also wants to rewrite the 13th Amendment, because that still seems to allow for slavery as a form of punishment. So he has several very specific points on his 100 days plan, in which
Ooh, wide echoes.
Yeah.
Right.
That's his conviction is that sexism and racism and white supremacy are written into these foundational documents, and that it would be a very good step to publicly also change that, in order to acknowledge that yes, we the people also includes women. We the people also includes people.
So you want to rewrite the American Constitution the way the Canadians have done, opening it up for more multicultural perspectives and all that. Yeah. And you have the same claim that you're speaking for the people, the way Trump does, the way he does, the way anyone does, I guess, in American politics.
Yeah, but then from we the people to all the people, speaking for all the people.
Yeah, your definition of who constitutes the people is fundamentally different in both cases.
Yeah.
Points to a wider contradiction in American history, right? The way in which an American nation, the two opposing ways in which an American nation has been historically defined, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the outer definition that is sort of present in some of the language, some of the more universalistic language of these kind of foundational documents that we talk about, right? And then there's the practical definition that, we the people has often been a very kind of narrow subsection of it, right? Jefferson in one sense, sort of articulates the most expansive view of liberty for all people, and meanwhile owns several hundred. Right, that's that contradiction which remains kind of foundational through American history, and which in a sense we're still kind of bucking up against in the way that we sort of think about present politics, in the way that we think about the past, right? The way in which the movement to topple statues and sort of rename some of the most overt kind of. It started obviously with some of the most kind of overt symbols of segregation and slavery in the Confederacy, but raised in different contexts, raised different questions about the veneration of somebody like Christopher Columbus, or in New York, Theodore Roosevelt, right? Is it possible to, which raises the question, right? Is it possible to sort of write a different kind of history of the United States within that existing framework and simply redefine it? Or do we, is it possible to still look at those kind of symbols of the states, the federal governments, and sort of not think of that as being implicitly sort of complicit in the expropriation of African Americans, the expropriation of Native Americans in segregation?
I think we could decide, that, okay, in that particular historical moment, it was obvious, that we, the people, was a group of white land-owning men. And we can prove that. I think in several documents it becomes quite clear that this was the way that it was intended. I think especially of that letter that John Adams wrote to Abigail Adams, where he sort of is surprised that there's so much unrest because they're declaring independence, and hey, would you believe it? There you have women, you have servants, you have natives, you have black people who all begin, to want a piece of that cake, and he's surprised because of that event. And I think that we can still believe in Obama's belief, that we can create a more perfect union, if the reality is so different. If you have such disproportionate amounts of people in jail, or in trouble, or in poverty, or committing suicide, or having all kinds of social issues, it becomes very difficult to actually hold on to this belief.
But this is the question I have for both of you, for Mathilde and Edward, because in moral terms, if you want, in ethical terms, I can perfectly understand how important it is to appeal to a formal equality that has been absent throughout the history of the United States, which has been an history of empire, exploitation, multiple segregation, class, gender, racial point of view. And of course, this all leads to define the United States in negative terms. There are books like Basiewicz one that openly define the U.S. foreign policy as a long succession of war, long wars, or the United States of War is the title of the latest book by David Vine, Imperial Democracy, so forth and so on. Now, but politically, the reality is different. In order to bring about change in a system that remains a two-party system, that remains so extremely polarized, wouldn't it be better to try to channel these forces, these impulses, this stimulus for change through one of the parties, even reshaping the Republican one, then running on an independent ticket that risks, in a way, being completely ineffective from a political point of view?
I mean, there are all kinds of elements that you can take into account in trying to answer that issue. One of the interesting things, of course, about change in the American context is, and I think the example that Mathilde offers is exemplary in that sense. Even the critics will refer, even the critics of the current day American situation in society and politics will refer to the Declaration of Independence
Mm.
to, come up with their ideals. Even the critics of all kinds of elements of American society and history will come back to the Constitution to institutionalize the changes that they are seeking. I mean, the system is built somehow or other in a way that will even satisfy its harshest critics, because they will use the opportunities that the Constitution offers to bring about the changes that they seek. The Obama administration, or Obama personally, was an exceptionalist, right? He used exceptionalism all the time too, as a critical tool. So you see what's happening again and again, even the harshest critics of American society and history. And the same goes for Native Americans who are complaining about the situation, or African Americans or women, will try to use the system or certain founding documents to, talk about their ideals and bring about change. And that's one of the interesting aspects, I think, of this American political system that you can talk about or should talk about next to all kinds of problems like the Electoral College or other elements of the constitutional text that are creating havoc within the system these days.
Mm.
In response to what Dario was saying about the best ways to go about bringing change, I think that third party and independent candidates do have the power to draw attention to certain issues that are neglected by the Democrats, and that they, just because of the fear that they might lose voters over these issues, that they start paying attention to them. And I'm not saying that Mark Charles is introducing topics that no one talks about. I mean, lots of people talk about that, but his approach would seem to many people to be radical, although he himself doesn't think that's the right word. He says it's not radical, but it's reasonable. Many people will perceive of his ideas as extremely radical.
I mean, on a historian's level, you can refer to Jill Lepore's, survey of American history, These Truths, where you have a similar effort to bring together these different voices.
But in fact, that was my question in the end. I mean, the grammar of American politics seems to be adaptive, to be usable by different political families and different political ideologies. But the problem is that then you have a receiving end, which is American society. And there should be, the ability to discern whether or not your attempt to use the Constitution is genuine, or you are forcing it, bending it to an interpretation that is against the very principle of ideals that should, put together the whole society. And where do you think is the root of everything that is going bad in the United States? In the flexible American, in the pillars of the American political system, or in the lack of awareness within society, or in the lack of ability to really understand that politicians are playing their games with this principle? So in a lack of education, perhaps, of civic education.
I mean, it makes sense to refer to the lack these days, of course, given what is happening under Trump, right? I mean, you have the impression, who was it? Was it one of the New York Times columnists who once said during, was it 4 years ago or 5 years ago, that in her estimate, 5% of the American electorate was insane or crazy, and right? Probably a very optimistic assessment given today's situation, where 45% of the electorate is still supporting Trump, even though, his right-wing populism based on Andrew Jackson is utterly hypocritical, even though he claims to talk for the people in a way that, should be questioned again and again. Many voters do not have a sense of reality, are actually the victims of a kind of skewed sense of reality that makes them support a politician who's, right, simply an egotist, to put it mildly. So these days we're, of course, extremely tempted to talk about or refer to the lack of education as a problem in the political context. And the current day situation raises all kinds of old questions that 19th century people were discussing and members of the elite were discussing again and again. Who should participate? Should we exclude people who have, too low a sense of reality?
Isn't there a danger, though, of if we regard, we fall in a sense into the deplorables trap, basically. We can and probably should vehemently disagree with the sort of arguments that are sort of coming out of the right-wing media bubble. But sort of to dismiss kind of 40% of the American electorate as somehow irrational or has taken leave of its senses strikes me, if anything, it might be. I mean, I can't probably comment on that. It might be a rational assumption of what's going on, but politically, it's not
politically, it's relevant. Yeah, but you have to deal with it somehow or other. Yeah.
I would to add that I think that one of the, of course, education is extremely important in allowing people to get a proper sense of reality. But I think that the patterns of racialization within American society have also created or contributed greatly to this problem, that they have divided people in artificial ways that we're only now beginning to discern, in terms of keeping people apart and creating so many different worlds. Of course, that's part of today's identity politics also, but there was a very concerted effort also throughout American history to keep people in certain categories: white, colored, black, native, and to treat them all as though they had their own issues without there being any interconnections. And I think that I put a small pile of books here that I wanted to draw attention to. This is one which is researching like the ways that the black and native peoples, have always been thought of as being wholly separate. The African American Museum on the mall is there, and the Native American Museum is on the other side. But the interconnectedness between people, and there's like a whole host of books that begins to explore this particular issue. This is the most recent one, which looks into the African diaspora into Indian country. And I think that we can, and I think this is also the vibe within, what I started out with, the lack of polarization within the Democratic camp. I think that also is something that if we can dissolve those lines of separation and concentrate more on exchange and contact and shared.
But this is exactly the problem, Mathilde, because if on the one hand you have an abundant academic intellectual production that tends to recognize the performative role of so many decisions, of so many divisions within U.S. society, racial, but also economic, educational ones. On the other hand, you have a president that is playing and winning with a strategy that denies all of this. He even refuses to condemn white supremacy, even to recognize that it exists live on TV, and that seems to be normal. So I guess, the only answer I can have to that is that people just either don't care or don't understand. And then the question is, we are talking of a country that 40 years ago used to be the model, the democratic model, the leader for freedom and democracy in Western Europe, so including here in the Netherlands. Right. So the question is, what did go wrong?
We no longer consider the US a democracy given a president, who undermines the free press, who isn't willing to accept the election results. Yeah, what went wrong? Yeah, blame it on the Republicans, I always say.
Start with the project for a new American century.
There will not be a new American century, as many commentators, of course, will argue. Yeah. Our lives have been spent, the first half of my life was spent in the American century. The second half will be in what will not be an American century.
But doesn't your question, Dario, exactly go to some of the points that we've been making? If you ask the point sort of what went wrong, right? You have the idea that there was at some point in the past an American democracy that was fully functional and which acknowledged everyone's sort of rights equally. And as we've been discussing over the part of this conversation, that has simply not been the case, right?
It didn't exist.
Various sort of idealized sort of visions of the past that have come out, right? The idea of the 1950s, the Eisenhower era, right?
Right.
The Democrats wax somewhat nostalgically over the 1930s and the New Deal. Without really exploring the fact that the original New Deal was built on the back of Southern segregationists. Right? If you're asking the question what went wrong, it's in a sense sort of these inequalities have been baked into the American system from the beginning, and in a sense, this is purely my interpretation, but in a sense, in a period of now that in the sense that the economic fabric of society has sort of produced this enormous amount of socioeconomic equality on top of these sort of in-baked political issues. Now that we're seeing various groups basically saying, well, no longer, this is a society whose sort of various aspects no longer work for us.
Intriguingly, the references to American exceptionalist status or the Declaration of Independence is it the last ditch effort to keep the country together that can be used by different people? Jill Lepore knows American history. Barack Obama knows American history. They know that it consists of not just the rosy romantic stuff, but all of the negative elements that we're talking about. And yet, they will simply use the rhetoric that they know doesn't reflect reality in an effort to keep the whole thing together.
In a sense that very few other countries have a tendency to do. I'm not sure I can think of any example of a country that so consistently sort of locates its past in sort of identifies its past with certain forms of universal values.
Yeah.
Myths, this mythologizing take.
Who was it? I think Richard Hofstadter, who might have said, like, it's our curse to have an ideology for a country or something to that effect.
But in a way, this has been a daunting task for me. Every time I've been asked to teach courses on something that is quite popular in the United States and not so many people in Europe do, which is peace history. And every time at the beginning of these courses, I've asked my students, to close their eyes and try to think of something that reminds them of the United States. And most of the time is a conflict, either a war or the Civil War or the invasion of Iraq or something violent as the 9/11 attack. Seldom they've been thinking of the fact that the United States or American people, certain groups, have been able to reinterpret, and also give us our even modern conception and idea of peace. So what really keeps fascinating me about the United States is this ability of being contradictory, very bad, and at the same time even potentially very good. So the question is for both of you, and I know that, Edward, for you this is less valid because you will be a free man soon, but if you and you are both professors, so you both teach to students. If you have to teach just one single lesson about contemporary United States that you want to give to your students, what would that be?
Whoa. Just one lesson about the current day situation, or what are we talking about? The current day situation in American politics or American society?
Yeah, assuming in 20 years you will be teaching Trump's age as a matter of history, what would be the most defining feature about these days?
That's just an amazingly difficult question.
Well, to maybe rephrase it slightly, because it's something that's come up in our conversation with Mark Valenta as well. Like, if we imagine ourselves as historians writing in the future, the 2040s, the 2050s, Something we do in all of our books is to write an introduction in which we kind of try to frame the moment within kind of larger trends or context, right? What is the context in which we are? How would you write the introduction of that book about the presence that you're writing 30 years from now?
The presence would be the presence. The present situation can easily be defined in terms of the death throes of white hegemony in American society. That would be, the most obvious phrase to use at the moment, because that's exactly the problem that is, creating havoc in American society that the Republican Party faces. So, I mean, it's go and look at the figures of, the demographic groups participating in the elections. We'll go below 70% white voters, right, this year. So, I mean, that is one of the issues at the heart of the current day situation. Many white workers, under the impact of globalization and other issues, immigration issues, fearing, being anxious about their status in society, feeling endangered by feminism and all these kinds of developments. But it's in many ways, it's white hegemony coming to an end. That would be one of the defining features.
Okay. Well, I thought you were going to say just the end, or the beginning of the end, the conclusive chapter of a U.S. history book.
Yeah, I think that if I had to choose one particular thing, I always enjoy sort of trying to unearth things that have remained invisible, whether these are voices or people or groups of people or events. I'm with Mark Charles there also in his interest in the doctrine of discovery and the effects of the doctrine of discovery and the rhetoric of dehumanization, which he is convinced has also influenced American history profoundly. I think I would choose a novel in this particular case because I'm from American literature, and one of the novels that I've learned a lot from was Edward P. Jones's The Known World. And that is a history of a black slave owner, and it is a book that tries to avoid all forms of essentialism and thinking about race and thinking about institutions such as slavery and the construction character of both history and race. And I think that's a text in which all kinds of worlds also come into contact with each other. You have Native people, you have women, you have former slaves, slave owners of all kinds of backgrounds, and I find that that's the strength often of a novel, that it can invoke an entire world, and gives you as a teacher a lot of room to discuss all kinds of things that come together in a particular construction of reality. So that's what I would say, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, guys. It's been fantastic. I think we now topped 1 hour, so I guess it's more than enough. I don't want to squeeze you any further. This has been brilliant. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jess.
Leo.
Yeah, thank you very much.